So, hello, we are on air. Welcome all. Welcome to this webinar conducted by LIBER and the Working Group on Research Data Management in LIBER and the Steering Committee on Research Infrastructures. And today we concentrate on reproducibility librarianship, and we have Vicky Steeves with us from New York University. And she has a very interesting job profile. We will learn more about this in a couple of minutes. She works on integrating reproducibility practices into research workflows, advocates openness, and contributes to the development of open infrastructure and tools. So, but before we start, please put your questions in the chat, which you find on the left-hand side. There's this chat box, and we come to your questions after the presentations. And of course, as you will know, we will have a recording of this webinar. So please point your colleagues to the recordings, and also the presentation is available on Zenodo, so you can refer to the slides later on as well. And yeah, that's it for the introduction. And so, Vicky, I'd like to hand over to you. And
yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So hello, everybody. And my name is Vicky Steeves. I'm really excited to be here giving this webinar for what is the morning for me, but happy whatever time it is to everyone else. So a little bit about me. This is sort of my profile again. Openness is life. My job is sort of interesting, and so that's mainly what I'm going to talk about, sort of my day-to-day work on the job. So I'm a dual appointment between NYU Center for Data Science and the Division of Libraries, and my job description is a little atypical from other things that we've seen, particularly in the US, in that my job specifically is to focus on promoting values of openness and reproducibility on campus. So my overall goal as a digital steward, as a librarian, is to work with researchers and others of my colleagues to make fully reproducible work preservable, discoverable, usable, accessible. So within that sort of vision statement for my life and my career, there are lots of different subfields and facets that I'm going to go over in this presentation. So what is the problem that is trying to solve? And the problem is that research isn't being efficiently managed or made reproducible, and there are lots of reasons for this. But the bottom line is, a lot of the time, the workflows and processes that a lot of my patrons at a large research university engage in aren't really reproducible, and as a result, sort of, we all lose access to some really important research materials. So the first thing I always do when you talk about reproducibility is to define it. Because I'm sure, as everyone's noticed, you've seen lots of different definitions floating around. What's the difference between replication and reproducibility and rerunning and re-execution and all these thousands of different words that all start with RE, just trying to describe the same thing. So, oh, my citation isn't there, but this is from Victoria Stodden wrote a report for ICERM. That's ICERM. In 2013, it's the Institute for Computational and Experimental Research in Mathematics. And in that report, she and her co-authors defined reproducible research in these 5 ways. And I sort of think of them corresponding to this pyramid of reproducibility on the right-hand side. So just before I sort of talk about my job again, I'm just going to define our terms. So reviewable research is that there's enough for other people to sort of look at it and give a baseline assessment. So that's like the article, right? Like you can sort of see what the methods are at a high level. You can review it, and that's sort of that. But it doesn't really get to the heart of reproducibility. Replicable research, as defined by Stodden et al., is the tools are available to duplicate the author's results using their data. So for instance, in the case of library work, I always think about this in terms of OpenRefine, because OpenRefine is one of the most reproducible tools that enable reproducibility writ large. It's awesome. So I always think about giving someone my JSON file from OpenRefine and my raw data, And if they can take that and make it work, then it's replicable. And then there's confirmable. So that's pretty much you have the data, the documentation, and you don't necessarily need the author's tools to get to the same conclusions. So instead of using OpenRefine, you might say, oh, no, I know how to do this in R or in Excel, and I'm going to do that instead. And if you reach the same results, then my research is confirmable. And the last one is, the second to last one is auditable. So that's basically everything is archived such that can be defended later. So that's the code, the data, the documentation, and everything sort of necessary. And then I would argue this last part, the auditable research made openly available, why I've bolded it is that I think it's sort of the goal. And this is where I want all of my patrons someday to end up, and also myself. And that involves making this last piece, the environment, also available. So when I think about reproducibility, I'm thinking about it not only from, can I rerun the same things, the same process with the same data, I'm also thinking about how did the computational environment affect reproducibility? So sort of I'm taking a holistic view, and when I describe it to my patrons in my day-to-day interactions, I often try to define it on the spectrum, because, you know, it's not a white or black thing. You're not completely reproducible or not reproducible at all. There's lots of gray area. And so I find that this definition from Stodden et al. Accurately portrays that sort of wiggle room. So some of the challenges in just everyday reproducibility is what someone called the work and time challenge, which is, of course, that it's a time commitment to get everything ready to share and then to share it. But I would pose this as the incentive problem. So reproducibility takes time, and it's not always valued by our reward structure. It's the same for data management. Getting people to write documentation is sometimes like pulling teeth. And it's just because taking the extra time to write that documentation isn't valued by a tenure and promotion. They're not going to look at how good your documentation is. And so Victoria Stodden also did a survey of her community in machine learning. So she found that 77% of folks in this conference, the NIPS conference, which was just changed to Neural IPS, they are one of the biggest machine learning conferences in the world. And 77% of attendees feel that they do not have the time to document and clean up their code, which with the rise of machine learning is troubling. And then Carol Tenepier from the conference Beyond the PDF, which is now, I think, and somebody in the chat, correct me if I'm wrong, has morphed into the Force 11 conference. I know like one was a predecessor to the other, but she found that insufficient time is the main reason why scientists do not make their data and experiment available and reproducible. I'm not going to take the time to make it available if I'm not going to get any credit for it. It's sort of the point here, and it's because it's not always valued by our academic reward structure. So the other challenges in reproducibility that I also, well, at least the first one I try and tackle in my service as a librarian, is technical obsolescence. So I think we all try to, or a lot of us try and tackle this as librarians, digital archivists as well. Technology changes affect reproducibility. What runs on R3 might not work in R6, or Python 2, the change to Python 3. These changes affect the way that our analyses are run, and they affect the different ways in which people can reproduce our work. And then there's a link at the very bottom of this slide down here that links to this study that found there's a very high level of what's called normative dissonance. So basically, what I say I believe doesn't always match my practice. And we found this the authors of this study found it to be particularly true in regards to openness and reproducibility. So the authors found when they surveyed scientists that the majority of their participants themselves believe, yes, I want to be open and reproducible, and I totally buy in 100% to these ethics of research. And they asked them, do you think your colleagues also do buy into these values? And I think about 60% of them were like, yeah, I think my colleagues, they believe in it. And then they asked, to what extent do you practice? So how much of your work is open? How much of your work is reproducible? And I think about 30% of them said, yes, my stuff is totally open and reproducible, which wasn't tested. And then they said, how much do you think your colleagues' work is open and reproducible? I think 5% or something. So there's a big difference between our espoused values, our practice, and how we perceive the practice of others. But this is really, to me, the pipeline problem. So reproducibility requires skills that are not included in most curriculums. So Kohlberg et al. Found at this repeatability conference at the University of Arizona, they said it would require a huge amount of effort to make our code work with the latest versions of these tools. And so this assumes a lot for the scholarly record and for us as a library providing service to sort of keep the scholarly record around for as long as possible. So we see this sort of problems with technology and culture in this article. So this article came out in PLOS One, and the authors looked at this software called FreeSurfer, which is a neuroscience analysis software. And the authors wanted to test whether or not different versions of the software actually affected the output of their research. And so they looked at it between two different types of workstations, between different versions of the software itself, and between different versions of Mac. And they found that there were significant differences revealed between FreeSurfer version 5 and the two earlier versions. So that's 4.5 and 4.3. And so this is actually a difference in the output of their analysis. So it's not even that, the process runs differently. It's the results that they got back were different. And they also found smaller differences between the different workstations and between the different versions of Mac. So reproducibility is a challenge and an opportunity that ranges not only in the very cultural, right? How do we make it attractive for people to make their work reproducible? How are we putting in rewards? How are we baking it into peer review, things like that? But then also the very technical. So actually, the landscape of our computers make it very hard to have our work be reproducible. And so as a result, my day-to-day work as a reproducibility librarian falls into three essential categories, or so I have conceptualized it. I'm happy to hear from other people. There's education. So I teach a lot of regularly scheduled classes in the library. I teach about 15 classes a semester in the library. I also teach embedded classes. So faculty members will reach out and say, could you do a course on reproducibility with R for my data science for social good class, which is the example that I've linked in the slide. I say, sure, of course, and I go in and I specialize the workshop to the class, and I sort of impart that to students. It's mainly for graduate students. I don't see that many undergrads in general as a part of my service. The other part that I do is special workshops. So in the US, when you get a grant and you're a grad student, you have to attend this thing called Responsible Conduct of Research training, which is 8 weeks, one course a week. And I usually teach the data management section for a lot of our departments here on campus. So, and I'm going to go into this later, but I do posit that good reproducibility requires good data management. And then, it takes you about 80% of the way there. And then the last sort of 20% of reproducibility are some of these deeply technical and cultural issues. I also make all of my materials openly licensed and available. I linked my LibGuide there. All of my class materials are available for other folks on campus, in library land, wherever, who want to use them. So I do my best to give back all of the things I've learned from the community of librarians that I have engaged with. So feel free to use my stuff. The other part of my work is just a lot of on-the-ground outreach. So I teach a lot of these classes because I really went out in the campus and talked to everyone. So the first thing I did when I arrived at NYU was I met with every single liaison librarian, so subject specialist, just to get a sense of sort of what their departments do in terms of research. How often do they use the library? Do you think what special service in terms of data management and reproducibility do you think they would benefit from? I met with digital archivists to see how are you handling archiving research software? Is that on people's radar? And then IT, because in my department in the library, we split it with IT. So we partner with them for a lot of the research technology types of initiatives. And then, of course, I went out and spoke to a lot of researchers, both one-on-one and in a group in the lab setting. So like the first year I was on the job was pretty much just talking to people. And then that sort of resulted in an influx of requests for the classes that I teach. And then the other side of things is sort of the tools and infrastructure part. So like I said earlier, reproducibility, about 80% of it is just really good data management. And then about 20% is infrastructure based. So I can't run the same thing on my Linux machine that you did on your Mac, and this is a big problem. So I work on a tool called Reproducibility, which is a tool that tries to fix that problem, that if it runs on my Linux machine, it should run on your Windows or Mac. Everything that I build and do is completely free and open source. That was a very strong stance I took when I started building the service. If it's reproducible but no one can see it, does it really exist? Is it really reproducible? Like if a tree falls in the forest, etc. So it was really important to me to build my service of reproducibility around sort of the open source for open scholarship initiatives, to partner with nonprofits, and to build and contribute to tools that are openly available. So the other one I work on is Tagget, which is for qualitative data analysis. So you might have heard of a few of the big ones. We license them on campus, things like In Vivo and Atlas. So Tagget is a free and open tool that lets you tag documents and other things like that. So, and I noticed there was a gap in the landscape of qualitative tools. There's not many that are free. And so we started to work on that problem. The other part that I do a lot, and this comes from being a dual appointment with the Center for Data Science, is I work a lot with the research engineers there. So like the UK, NYU and a few other schools in the US have started to hire research engineers. So these are people who are dedicated to building open source software for research. So I sort of went out of my way to collaborate a lot closely with them. And in turn, I end up teaching a lot of the great software that they make. So that's sort of my day-to-day. It's a mixed bag, as always, talking to people, educating, and then sort of coming on to these tools and infrastructure projects. So I have 3 offices, which is great because no one knows where to find me. Just kidding. But it's really great because I get to see lots of different people. So I have an office at the Center for Data Science where I do office hours, and they're attended by folks who want everything from how do I get a book from a different library delivered here, all the way to I need to publish data. What's the best license or repository for publishing data, or hands-on help with things like Reproducibility and Tagget. So I also have an office in NYU's main library, which is the Elmer Bopst Library here in Washington Square. And so that's where I sit with all of my colleagues in the library, and where I collaborate a lot with them, where I give my classes and meet students. And then I also have an office in the computer science department in our School of Engineering. And this happened, I think, a lot by accident, but it has actually worked out extremely well, where I get to see, the engineering campus, which is in Brooklyn. So it's, across a body of water from where everyone else at NYU is. So it's great to see a different campus and to see the needs there. And in fact, there I get to engage really deeply with folks on some of the technical issues that I really enjoy. So it's very cool. My teaching materials are on a mix of GitHub and GitLab. So you can see it's NYU-Data Services. And then on my personal GitLab, I keep a lot of the extracurricular work that I do. So what I mean by extracurricular, I guess, would be like a webinar like this I might have put on my GitLab, or I taught a short course on reproducibility for the University of Utah. Those materials are on GitLab. And then I also keep a curated feed on Twitter at ReproFeed, which is just sort of things I see around reproducibility. So again, trying to reach a broad audience. So the first lesson I always teach, you can't have any sort of reproducibility without good data and project management. And so my emphasis when I'm teaching reproducibility is first teaching data management. So again, it gives you everything on this pyramid except the environment part. And so my classes really emphasize starting small and scaling up. Again, it's not a value judgment. It's not, you must learn containers tomorrow. It's, oh, I see you don't have any backups. Maybe we start there. Maybe we learn how to document our code together, or we talk about literate programming. So as you can tell, I'm also a pretty informal speaker. So lots of my classes tend to be very informal. I take a very playful approach with very cute graphics, like my hurt computer and my devil computer, which represent human error and what we call dependency hell, which is that sort of chain of things on your computer that breaks reproducibility. And so when I teach, the slide usually gets a laugh, and I'm sad this is a webinar because it does make people chuckle, but it also gets me on the level of the learners and the students, which is very important for teaching in general, but especially when you're teaching something as complicated and as individualized as reproducibility. So the other thing I try to sort of practice what I preach, of course. So I do a lot of my work with literate programming because I think it's a really great approach for a lot of folks on how to work more reproducibly. So these are some example materials that I made in Bookdown. So if you know how to write text, you could make this. It's just all markdown files. So it's pretty powerful. And often when I teach this sort of hands-on work, and this screenshot is from actually my class at the University of Utah, I find that it's a really approachable way to show people how to take notes as well. So I often try to incorporate a lot of active learning, but the active learning that I try to work with is not predicated on folks downloading and installing a million things. It's okay, I'm going to show you how to interweave code and text. And if you can write a text file, you can do this. And so giving people those early wins are just very important. My favorite outcomes when I teach reproducibility, my patrons take something and apply it to their daily work. So usually this turns out to be storage related, but sometimes it's like using version control or asking me about containers and how they can make things reproducible across different operating systems. They keep asking me questions. And my favorite outcome that is a little bit harder to measure is that I want people to read more interdisciplinary work around reproducibility. So each domain has really interesting takes and really interesting literature and presentations about reproducibility for them. And I really encourage folks to branch out and not look for instead, what is reproducibility for library and information science research, but sort of what is it broadly, how are different people approaching it, what works well for my personal workflow. For qualitative research, the question of reproducibility has not really been extensively scrutinized because I think there's a lot of cultural barriers there. It's qualitative, it's hand coding text and images and audio and video. It's not something that I can rerun on a click, right? So what does it mean to be reproducible for qualitative research? These are some open questions that I think we're all thinking about. And I think reading a little bit more in disciplinary work will help branch the sort of existing lit on reproducibility. So I always encourage folks to do that too. So again, I met with lots of people my first year, making sure services exist, things that all librarians do. I also helped manage a reproducibility symposium on campus. So we had faculty and students and staff present tools and workflows and research about how working reproducibly has helped them, how they've approached it. And we got a very wonderful array of folks from different domains at the symposium, economics, history, data science. It was very great. So that was one of the best outreach events I did, simply because I got to see a great broad range of people. And so again, then the other part is the tools and infrastructure. So ReproZip is this tool that I work on for full computational reproducibility. So it's sort of making things in an archival package to be sent across different operating systems. Another sort of low barrier thing I did was get us the Open Science Framework for institutions. So again, thinking that reproducibility is 80% data management, 20% the rest. The OSF provided a really nice way to propagate best practices in research data management, and it's really taken off at NYU. So we have over 40 public projects and over 90 private projects. The last time I looked, the last time I counted, which was a while ago, because there are a lot and I don't want to count them all the time. But you could look at osf.nyu.edu and you could see sort of how people are using it. And it's also been a great way for me to tailor my service. And then again, this thing, Tagget, which is a qualitative data analysis software. So this is basically the idea of ReproZip. So this is one of the cooler things I get to work on as a reproducibility librarian, sort of supporting this infrastructure project that takes place in the Center for Data Science, where folks can basically package everything necessary to reproduce the research and open and unpack and reproduce it anytime. And that's just at reprozip.org. And here's sort of what the OSF page looks like. Thanks for linking it in the chat. Basically, people log in to the OSF with their NYU credentials. They get on this landing page if they associate their project with NYU, and you get seamless access to NYU resources like Google Drive. So we found that having this resource available has really helped us propagate those best practices and in openness and data management, and on occasion, sort of taking it that next level into reproducibility. And this is Tagget, which I think I've talked about. And so, you know, what generally works when I'm teaching reproducibility, horror stories, it's terrible to say, but they really motivate. I would say weirdly all the stuff I learned in library school, but it's not that weird. So I took an introduction to digital stewardship class during my library science degree. And basically I teach all of that to researchers. So, you know, use open file formats, have documentation, have backups, make sure your stuff is in a software agnostic platform. You know, all these best practices for data management and reproducibility were all just sort of my intro to digital archiving class. And again, giving folks the small wins and then ramping up into sort of the larger scale reproducibility initiatives like using containers or ReproZip or something to capture the computational environment in your operating system, things like that. What generally doesn't work. So again, I try to give definitions up front in very plain language. I do a lot with this computational reproducibility. So starting very technical is something I sometimes have to do, but can be very hard in the context of teaching and delivering services. And then the last part I always throw in, but I hope it's well understood in our field that, you know, I don't make value judgments. Reproducibility takes a lot of time and effort. For the reasons I've outlined, cultural, technical, and so I do my best to push reproducibility without making a value judgment based on people's actual practice. So again, so we've seen, it's emerging, but it's been around for a while now. This field of data librarianship, we offer things like data management, data services, statistical support, GIS, data and information literacy, grant support, repository services, and all of these could really fold into supporting reproducible research practices as the natural next step. And so, you know, my hope is that we take sort of the data management, data services model and extend it out to include reproducible research into the fold. And that's sort of what my approach has been at NYU. Here's some light reading. Not super light. I did write a report about my job. It's in the journal called Collaborative Librarianship. Franklin Sayre and Amy Rinkelman, so sorry, Amy, if I pronounced that wrong, wrote in CRNL about the reproducibility crisis and opportunities for academic libraries. Cynthia Vitale wrote a great piece about reproducibility as the new data management. And then the last few parts of this bibliography are more general. So things that I often give to researchers who want sort of a first foray into reproducibility. So Lorena Barbara, her lab has a syllabus on working reproducibly. There's a great PLOS 10 simple rules about computational reproducibility. The 5 selfish reasons to work reproducibility, also wonderful. And how scientists fool themselves and how they can stop. So that sort of touches on that normative dissonance piece I said earlier. So in summary, good data management leads to good reproducibility, but doesn't guarantee it. So a lot of my reproducibility classes and services started there. You can also start there. I would recommend encouraging folks and you yourself to work reproducibly in very small ways and gear up. And, start with free and open source tools and apply for money should you need or want it. But it's worth noting that in reproducibility, if someone has to pay $600 to reproduce your work, then, I would call into question how reproducible it actually is. So that's my little purist part of the presentation. Feel free to email me and ask me questions. You can tweet at me, toot at me if you're on Mastodon, and feel free to reuse my teaching materials. They're usually CC BY or CC BY NC. So you can the license is always on them. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I think the last part of the webinar is for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Vicky. This was very interesting. And please, folks, come up with some questions. In between, I wondered how this journey started for you in terms of how did you start with this journey becoming such a,
Yeah, so my career path is very weird. I participated in this thing at Simmons University, which is my university in Massachusetts. They have a great library school in the US, so that's where I wanted to go. I knew I wanted to be a librarian, and so I started my undergrad thinking I would do English, and I was sort of persuaded to take one intro to computer science class, and I fell in love with it. And my advisor said to me, I heard you want to be a librarian. Do you want to try out this thing? And the thing she wanted me to try out was the 3+1 program. So I did my bachelor's in computer science in 3 years and my library and information degree in 1 year. So 4 years for both. And then I did a post-grad fellowship. It's what's called the National Digital Stewardship Residency Program. And I did that at the American Museum of Natural History. And that was my sort of first foray into research data. Previously, I thought I wanted to go into digital archiving for architecture. I worked at an architecture firm at the time, and I really liked it. And then I did this project at the AMNH in New York City, and I loved it. And then this job at NYU opened up, and, it all went uphill from there. That was great. Yeah. It started from there.
Yeah, you had the right skill set ready for this job, right?
Maybe. I will say I'm one of the very few librarians in this space with a degree in computer science. It's totally not necessary. But it has been helpful just because my interests lie in infrastructure in general.
Yeah, so maybe let's have a look. There was one question from Stefan. When you arrived at New York University, did you have classes ready to go? You said you teach a lot. Did you brought materials already? In terms of all these teaching activities, or?
Yeah, so my first year at NYU, I taught 2 classes a semester. So one was Intro to Data Management, and the other was writing a data management plan for grants. And then the next year, I think we ramped up to 8, and we included, so there's one other data management librarian, and he and I work closely together. So I'm saying we, I mean Nick Wolf and myself. And so we taught 2 classes the first year, and then we kept ramping up until this year, where I feel like we sort of hit our maximum, where I don't want to teach more than I'm teaching, regularly scheduled, because I also teach the embedded classes added on. So 15 are just what's on the calendar. The public calendar. There are lots of things just on my calendar for one-offs for professors. And so none of those materials were ready to go at all. I had to make them as I was going.
Yeah. And how many teaching hours are these? In total hours?
I don't know.
A lot. I can't imagine. 15 sounds massive. So.
Yeah. It's spread out over the course of a semester. But I do spend a lot of time on teaching.
And how about, what do you think is the relationship to funder mandates and policies? Is there a connection in terms of, do you think there's a need to enforce this type of reproducibility? And I have not seen it in a lot in terms of, funder requesting reproducibility so far. I mean, so far it's data management and making data open wherever possible.
Yeah, so in the US, there's a few initiatives. So there's the NIH Rigor and Reproducibility Initiative, but it's not a requirement, right? It's like a DMP. They ask for it, you submit it as a part of your grant, but I don't think anyone is going back and checking to the extent that you've made your work reproducible. I will say I do overall think it's being taken seriously by researchers. I don't think it's dependent on funders enforcing things. So reproducibility is a bit different from openness in that regard, where people want to be reproducible for lots of reasons. For instance, within a lab group, when you onboard new students, it makes it a lot easier if your stuff, has documentation and can be run by other people on other machines. So reproducibility, even for things that aren't open, is seen as just, making research more efficient, and researchers like that generally, in my experience.
Yeah.
The problem lies in the workflow part of things. So as much as you can integrate into people's existing workflows is best, because people aren't very likely to change without a lot of enforcement, maybe. So for things like the data management plan, where the actual enforcing comes in on the sharing side, I think, more than perhaps other parts of it. And so I think reproducibility, to overall just answer the question in summation, reproducibility is being taken seriously by researchers because when it's put to them, a lot of them know it's about efficiency. And for the other folks, it's ethical, it's altruistic, it's, my stuff should be reproducible so other people can use it. So I think it's being taken seriously. The making it open is the part that I would say needs enforcement more than anything else. I hope that answers Stefan.
Yeah. And are other researchers taking this up in terms of skilling? Because you say, it's so far has not arrived really in the curricula. Has there been efforts at New York University or other places you are aware of to take this more seriously?
Yeah, so I mentioned the NIH. I don't know of any specific funder or publication mandates. I know there are a few journals that have a reproducibility review, but it's opt-in. So researchers, authors submit their work for a reproducibility review. And then that gets turned into basically a review paper where the reviewers go through and try to double check if it's reproducible or not. And then it results in a paper co-authored between the authors and the reviewers. So I was part of one for a journal called Information Systems, which was very cool. But in general, I don't know of lots of, sticks out there. Lots of carrots, lots of people giving very good and compelling reasons for reproducibility, but not a lot of folks sort of mandating it.
And how about disciplines? Which do you think are most receptive to the reproducibility message? Take this.
I think the ones that are highly collaborative. I think that's where a lot of the issues around reproducibility tend to bite people. So folks that are forced to collaborate, so high energy physics, forced to collaborate, they tend to take reproducibility extremely seriously. In disciplines where there are more lone wolves, folks tend to be less receptive to that message. So I think it depends on sort of the type of work you're engaging in. Like I said, for qualitative, I don't think a lot of the questions around definitions of reproducibility has been answered. So I think for a lot of the disciplines that do mixed methods, they think reproducibility only applies to the quant side and hasn't really taken hold yet in qual. So I'm hoping that will change. But that's sort of where I see the next step in terms of branching to different disciplines and catering messages to different disciplines.
Yeah, I had before, when I announced the webinar, a colleague from CERN pointed me to her article on reproducibility in the high energy physics. I put this in the chat as well, I mean, for people to have a look at. So
yeah. And I like the title already, Open is Not Enough.
Open is not enough, yeah, indeed. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, correct.
If it's open, if you have open data, open code documentation, it's wonderful. And it's good data management, and it's a good best practice, and it's ethical, and it's all those things. But they're right in that it doesn't guarantee reproducibility.
So do you have this concept of data champions in the US? I mean, that people are located in the faculty in terms of being the contact and someone from the library coordinating data management, learning, and implementation. Do you work with such folks? I mean, in the faculties and
I mean, I work with folks who are not called data champions, but maybe should be.
So have similar roles, yeah.
It's not an official thing that we have on campus, but I do work and coordinate with lots of faculties. So part of my job means that I sit on this university-wide committee. It's the Committee for Reproducibility and Open Science. It was started as a part of the Moore Sloan Data Science Environment, which is a big grant that our Center for Data Science has. And so one of the working groups in that has branched out to include lots of faculty across the university is this Reproducibility and Open Science group. And so I'm the only librarian, it's all other faculty, and it's been a great entree into sort of getting the feel for how people are conceptualizing reproducibility on campus. So are they teaching with literate programming? Are they teaching with version control? Do they touch on containerization or anything like that? So while we don't have a specific program, I do have a number of faculty that I collaborate with and coordinate events with, and get student workers with to look at reproducibility type stuff. And so it's not official, but I do it, and I really love it. I love talking to different people across the university and seeing how they are approaching this, approaching reproducibility and data management. One of the cooler things that I recently did was a presentation in linguistics for the folks at NYU who study endangered languages. And I found out that if you get a National Science Foundation grant for endangered languages, 8% of your grant goes to a disciplinary repository, which is extremely cool. And I would have never have found that out if I was not physically present and discussing and collaborating with the faculty members there. So that was a really roundabout way to answer that question, but I'll just underscore the point. I really enjoy working with faculty who maybe should be called data champions, but are currently not.
And do you link this to you have subject librarian types in the library as well who are in charge of the linguistics. I mean, do they talk to you or have a role in this as well? I mean,
he was there.
Or are they scared?
He was there. They're not scared. The librarian for linguistics was with me. And I often collaborate with the liaisons. And I think I tried really hard to do that groundwork. So again, the first thing I did at NYU was meet all of them and start a dialogue. And that was hugely impactful for my service moving forward. I would not have been able to be as successful as I feel I've been without the support of the other librarians at NYU. And so it's been great.
So what's their role there when it comes to data management? Do they engage in this as well, or?
Yeah, I mean, so they know people want to be engaged at different levels, of course, and it's up to them. The baseline is they know enough to at least refer people to me. Yeah. If they have a question. Other folks are eager to and want to answer a lot of these questions on their own. And, they loop me in. So I'll often get a lot of email CC'd where people give advice and they basically CC me just to say, if it's incorrect, correct me, which is great. And likewise, if I have a question that's disciplinary specific, I'm very comfortable in reaching out to the liaisons and saying, listen, this is what I would say from the perspective of reproducibility or from data management, but how do you think this would impact the work of people in your department? Do you think they would be into it? Do you think they would be, receptive to this type of a message? And so I've been able to refine a lot of my service and outreach in discussion with the liaison librarians, with digital archivists, so with a number of people across the libraries, which has been absolutely great.
Yeah. So maybe let's look at a couple of more questions. There was one question from Jennifer. Have you ever had to convince IT regarding the use of open source software? Was there?
The short answer is yes. So I don't have to convince IT of using anything in regards to my own service. So if I want to teach using only open source software, I just sort of give them the list and say, please make sure it's installed on the computers, and they don't cause a fuss. If it's about using open source software for enterprise level initiatives around research technology, there is a bit of convincing, because the idea is, from their perspective, is they want something that's easy to manage, something that has a lot of security, that wouldn't be a stretch on their resources. Which at NYU is complicated, because we spend a lot of money on things, and I feel like we could stand to spend a little bit more on labor. A lot of my conversations with IT about open source have been exactly that, saying we should invest back into the community. And to some extent, it's been successful. We do use lots of open source software around for research infrastructure. Our DSpace, we have a repository that's DSpace. I think we're going to move over to Invenio. A lot of our archiving software is open source. So the short answer is yes. The long answer is it depends on what it's supposed to be used for.
Okay. And then from Garrett, I mean, would you say there's a disconnect between building reproducibility into RDM best practice and the perception that these are just a set of practices that occur once the data have been captured for long-term preservation? So starting somewhat later, I don't know.
Yeah.
When does
reproducibility come into the workflow for RDM? This is a really good question. It really depends on the workflow. So for instance, ReproZip, this thing that I work on, it used to be called, like if you look at the early papers from 2012 or something, it's called reproducibility after the fact, because the goal of ReproZip was to sort of say, you don't have to think about reproducibility from the beginning to be able to be reproducible. Run this thing after your process works and it will be reproducible. And it does do that. There are other things that require reproducibility to be built in at the beginning. Like if you're using a container, you probably want to use that container like a Docker or Singularity or something like that, that is basically a way to send operating systems to and from each other. If you do that, you should probably be working in a container from the beginning. So it's different depending on the tools that you want to use to work reproducibly from a computational perspective. I will say that there is a perception that what it takes to be reproducible is a whole like separate gigantic set of things on top of RDM best practice. And like I said, I think the split actually in reality is more like 80-20. The hard part too is capturing things reproducibly for the long term requires software preservation. Like if it runs on MATLAB from 2018 to really effectively rerun it in the future, you probably need MATLAB 2018 because MATLAB probably won't make things backwards compatible. Like I can't run the stuff from 2018 on MATLAB 2010. So I think one area, it's not only about the data being captured for long-term preservation, but it's also software and workflow. And I think those are the things that set reproducibility, set it apart from data management, that extra set of required dependencies. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And then was one last question. I mean, Francesco is asking if there's a kind of a mapping. So like, this is maybe the tool you are using, and this is the alternative, which makes your work more reproducible. So,
I don't know about reproducible, but it definitely more open. Oh my goodness. I'm thinking of her name. She's very popular on Twitter. She's very prolific. She's German. She made a giant mapping of tools and in this beautiful image.
Yeah, but this is the Dutch folks. It's not the German folks.
No,
yeah,
I know.
It's Bianca Kramer and
Yes,
Jeroen Sonderborn. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. They have the tools classified by activity, and of course, not everything is open in this list, but they have some workflows.
Might be on her country of origin. Yes. Sorry, I'm like scrolling through her Twitter feed right now, trying to drop a link in the chat. It's Miss Phelps is her. Yeah. I'll at least link her Twitter. Go search in her Twitter images for this exact thing. It exists. Oh, innovations in scholarly communication.
Yes.
Changing research workflows. That's the title. Okay. So look at that, Francesco. You might find some
big survey. Yeah, with many tools. Okay, so I think we are ready to close for today. Thank you again very much, Vicky, for your excellent presentation.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, keep us posted through Twitter.
Definitely.
on developments. Yeah, thank you all for joining us today, and see you next time. Bye-bye.